All right, we'll give folks just another minute or two to jump in, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we're going to get started now. Jack, if you wouldn't mind sharing the PowerPoint. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Alina Kostinovska. I'm a fifth-year graduate student in the Science Policy Group at UCSF. We are a non-hierarchical group of students, postdocs, staff, and faculty that are passionate about science policy and advocacy. If you're interested in joining and helping out build more events like this, please go to our website, spg@ucsf.org. You can also DM myself, Alex Monroy, or Jack Stevenson, and we can add you to our Google group. So we do want this to be an interactive experience, so there will be time for 1 to 2 questions at the end. Please DM your questions to Alex Monroy throughout the chat. She will be keeping track of them, and then we will select one. Please note that if you type in a question, unless you explicitly ask us not to, we may spotlight you, that is, bring you up to ask your question. And with that, today we have a really exciting set of panelists to help us understand what defunding the police and abolition entails. Unfortunately, Alex Karim is unable to join us today, but I'd like to introduce you to my co-moderator, Leandrew Daly, who is a third-year graduate student at UCSF from the Navajo Nation and an organizer with Cops Off Campus. Leandrew, please kick us off.
Thank you, Alina. So the first panelist that we have is Alec Karakatsanis, who graduated from Yale College in 2005 and Harvard Law School in 2008. Most recently, he is the author of the book Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Legal System, and the co-founder of Civil Rights Corps, a nonprofit organization dedicated to challenging systemic injustice in the United States' legal system, a system that is built on white supremacy and economic inequality. Before this, Alec was a civil rights lawyer and public defender representing impoverished people accused of district and federal crimes.
Kay Agbebiyi is a disabled organizer, social worker, and writer, originally from Kennesaw, Georgia. They are currently based in Atlanta, Georgia, where they serve as the new Georgia Policy and Movement Building Director for URGE. Outside of work, Kay is an organizer on the Free Ashley Now campaign, a campaign to free their friend, Ashley Diamond. They are also currently working on a book for the University of California Press. They are a former member of Survived and Punished New York's chapter and a co-creator of 8 to Abolition.
Last but not least, Aditi Joshi is a South Asian femme, daughter of immigrants and resident on unceded Ohlone lands, currently working as a senior design researcher at Code for America, working in the criminal legal system. Their practice shifts power to those marginalized by the system by centering those most directly impacted in product, policy, and service decisions. Healing-centered and trauma-informed, Aditi takes a holistic approach to their work to shift systems so that they care for all. They are also an organizer with Defund SFPD now.
So before we get started, we'd like to come to some shared definitions and understanding. The first is about abolition. Abolition is a positive project, not a negative one. In the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolition is not absence, but presence. Angela Davis also writes that abolition democracy is not only or not even primarily about abolition as a negative process of tearing down, but it is also about building up and creating new life-affirming institutions.
Mass incarceration refers to the unique way the US has locked up a vast population in federal and state prisons, as well as local jails. And the prison industrial complex is a term to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems.
Hypercriminalization is the process by which an individual's everyday behaviors and styles become ubiquitously treated as deviant, risky, threatening, or criminal across social contexts.
Community policing is a model that aims to put more police to continuously operate in the same area, with the goal of forming bonds in the community and building community trust for police. It originated in the mid-1960s under Lyndon B. Johnson and marked a return to foot patrols in targeted neighborhoods.
And carceral feminism refers to a reliance on policing, prosecution, and imprisonment to resolve gendered or sexual violence. It is also closely tied to the idea of white feminism. And with that, we'd like to play a short 1-minute video about abolition to get us all on the same page.
All right, baby, Abolition 101, let's get it. Abolition is a political vision and organizing strategy that's directly opposed to the prison industrial complex. The vision is a society in which police, punishment, and prisons is not the go-to answer to our problems, but rather our communities are safer and healthier because they are supported, equipped, and empowered to care for each other. Abolition doesn't mean people won't do bad things, but it does mean that our current reliance on the PIC does little to reduce violence and harm and actually perpetuates dysfunction rather than protecting us from it. The strategy is twofold: create, dismantle. Create the conditions that promote healthy and loving communities. It's not the most police places that are the safest, it's the ones with the most resources. Dismantle the power and reach of the PIC and the larger systems of white supremacy that demands it. This takes deconstructing our ideas of power, punishment, and justice, as well as more tangible actions. But if abolition is an end goal with reasonable steps, why scare people away with divisive language instead of just focusing on reform? That's because liberation don't happen on accident. If we don't clearly and boldly name the end goal, we ain't never gonna get there. Reform suggests that the system is broken and needs some updates or bug fixes. Abolition understands that the system is working exactly as designed, so we need a new system.
All right, with that being said, we're going to get into our questions. We just watched Abolition in 1 minute with Mr. Capehart. Starting with Aditi, in 1 minute or less, is there anything you would like to add? Just to get us all on the same page, what is the call for defunding the police, and what is the vision of police abolition?
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you all also so much for inviting me to come talk today. I think Mr. Capehart's video is really great in introducing the concepts around abolition. I think to make it really tangible for folks, I often point folks to a graphic that Critical Resistance in Oakland has made to sort of really distinguish reformist reforms with abolitionist reforms. A really clear example is around body cameras. So the question really being, does the change that we're looking to implement support funding or increasing the scope of the prison industrial complex? And body cameras obviously do that by increasing funding and increasing resources to policing. And I think that's a really useful distinction in thinking about how abolition actually works in practice on the ground. In terms of the call for defunding the police, so at Defund SFPD now, where I'm an organizer, we see defunding as a political strategy to get us to a goal of abolition. And at its core, it's really taking a look at the city budget and asking whether where we're putting our funding is actually what folks need on the ground and what communities need. And police abolition, more specifically, is also just reframing how we think about justice and accountability, and thinking about how we can take the funding from police and the prison industrial complex as a whole, and really put time and resources into the parts of life that people need and the resources that folks need, instead of on carcerality. So I think that's sort of maybe a little piece that I would add specifically on defunding and how that gets to the goal of abolition as well.
Thank you, Aditi. Those are very useful steps, and placing it in the context of San Francisco is really relevant to our audience. Would either Alec or Kay like to go next?
Alec, you can go if you'd like.
Sure, I don't have much to add. That was great, Aditi, and thank you so much for including me in this really amazing discussion. I guess I would just say one quick thing about abolition is that it's often portrayed by people that don't understand it or live their lives practicing it as some kind of a radical, scary phenomenon. People have a hard time understanding, like, what would our society look like without all the police and all the jails and all the prisons? But that's because I think those people are imagining our current world the same as it is, but just without all the police and jails and prisons. And of course, that seems like a radical idea because our current world is so full of pain and trauma and violence and suffering and inequality and alienation. And so it's very hard to imagine a world where we don't need institutions that are coercive and violent and brutal, like police, cages, tasers, guns, weapons, tanks, surveillance, prisons, borders, right? And so I think actually that the view that our current society with unprecedented levels of violence across the world, environmental degradation and hurtling towards civilizational collapse, like that is a radical view. And actually abolition is quite common sense and normal when you understand it as a project to make people safe and help communities and people thrive, and to remove the sort of coercive elements that are preventing people and their families and their communities and their loved ones from living normal, everyday, safe, thriving lives with each other. And I think sort of reframing abolition as sort of an obvious and normal response to a world that is incredibly violent and unjust is actually, I think, an important rhetorical framing for the movement, and also just objectively correct.
Thank you, Alec.
Yeah, I would just add that I personally don't think that we're going to have abolition if we have capitalism. And you can't really break that down in a 1 minute or 3 minute TikTok video. But yeah, I just don't see that happening. And then another thing is that I would say that abolition isn't just about like prisons and policing, but something that like Ruth Wilson Gilmore stresses is just the fact that we're gonna have to change everything. Like we're going to have to change our completely change the ways that we interact with each other, and the ways that we like build with each other, in order to abolish prisons and policing.
Thank you so much, y'all. Yeah, I think the quote that is being referred to as abolition is changing one thing, and that thing is everything. So that's I think a really apt point. Kay, we'll also start with you for the next question, which is that police abolitionists are typically against sort of mainstream calls for reforming the police, such as requiring verbal warning before shooting or requiring de-escalation training or body cameras, many of which are on the 8 Can't Wait reform platform. For the folks on the panel, why are reforms insufficient? What is the difference between reform and abolition? And why can't we just reform the police? And Kay, I want to start with you since you're one of the co-authors of 8 to Abolition, which is like a direct response to the 8 Can't Wait reforms.
Yeah, thank you for this question. When 8 Can't Wait came out, like a lot of people were sharing it just because I feel like, I mean, a lot of people haven't really taken the time to sit and interrogate policing, or interrogate like what the world would look like after our current system is abolished. So one of the things that I liked about 8 to Abolition was a lot of people were like, wow, this is like the first time I had ever really heard or read about abolition. And so I think it was a really great tool to bring some people in. The thing about reforms is, the first thing is they're ineffective. the way that like we have, or like the current system that we have now with prisons, that was a reform. And it's completely like ineffective. That's why we're all here tonight. And then another issue with reforms is that they often funnel more, sorry, I have a dog on my lap and he's doing his thing. They often funnel more money into the prison industrial complex without actually interrogating like why people commit certain crimes, or why some people are criminalized and not others. So I think the biggest issue with reforms is that they limit our imagination, and they also take away like resources that abolitionist organizers need to build something different. And they also just normalize the idea of policing. Like the system that we have now, or like policing as a whole, is, if I had to explain it to an alien, like I'm pretty sure they would be like, that literally makes no sense. But because that's like all that we know, we've normalized it, and reforms are another way that we can normalize it, by making people think that this is all that we can have. So we might as well just try to improve it a little.
Thank you so much for that answer. I always forget that the creation of prisons was a response to like the fact that we were just punishing people before. And then people are like, oh, why don't we try to actually reform them and integrate them? Aditi and Alec, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think maybe the only thing that I'll add is that I think the piece around reforms, like limiting our imagination, is super important. And I think also oftentimes reforms can like placate calls for abolition. And oftentimes like reforms don't actually even get implemented. So there might be like a really clear example is in Daly City, in the Bay Area, they had a reform to include body cameras in the Daly City Police Department like several years ago, and has yet to actually be implemented. And so it's sort of like showing that even when in theory reforms are passed, there's not really any sort of oversight onto how those are implemented. And then even if they are implemented, there's no correlation between any reform and the reduction of police harm or police murders in any locality. So it's pretty clear that reforms don't work, even when they are implemented, and there's not really any accountability for them even being implemented after they're passed at like legislative scale.
Thank you. Alec? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, those are what Kay and Aditi said are both like right on. I mean, just to add one other additional point is, to me, a really sort of commonly overlooked point is that reforms typically by definition are created and designed by the very same people and institutions and interests that created the thing that's being reformed. And so one of the things we need to focus on is building enough power so that a different set of interests and a different set of communities are the ones designing new systems. If not, I think most reforms are going to be designed to create a sort of a facade where they'll be trying to reproduce a lot of the same outcomes with different labels. And that's one thing we've seen over and over again, whether it's with the body camera example that Aditi mentioned, or community policing, which we'll be talking about later, or so-called bail reform. Really, as you go on and on down the list of things, tasers were offered as a reform. All of the things that are sold to people as reforms tend to come from a small group of elite bureaucrats or sort of corporate actors who have a lot invested in the overall mechanisms of punishment, control, and state-based violence, which is really all designed to extract wealth and to preserve existing distributions of wealth and power and social hierarchies, whether related to race or gender or immigration status. And reforms tend to be things that those same people design as somewhat more palatable, at least right up front, in the existing political climate, somewhat more palatable forms of that violence and control and surveillance. And that's a really key distinction between reforms and abolition. It's who is imagining them, who is coming up with them, and is it a multiracial working class coalition of people designing things that help their own communities, or is it people in power who are designing ever more sophisticated and precise methods of social control?
Well, thank you so much. I think the next question that we were actually talking about, which you just touched on, is community policing. So we mentioned that definition in our intro slideshow, but it's something that was first coined by Lyndon B. Johnson after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And it's kind of something that is brought up in 2015 and is being brought up again. So community policing, why is or isn't it a sufficient reform? Why can't police officers go out into neighborhoods and solve all our problems in terms of the relationship between people and police? Aditi, I'll go to you for this question.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I think there are a couple of pieces here. I think police embedding in communities, police sort of hosting events. You see like photos of police like hosting barbecues and things like that in communities. None of those things actually change the fact that there are police murders that happen each and every day. And the fact that police harm folks in communities every day. And I think a larger piece is that police are the first step in the funnel of the criminal legal system. And if community policing or community control of police happens, the rest of the criminal legal funnel still is happening. And community having control of like a violent institution doesn't do anything to make the institution's actions any less violent. I think another piece that's kind of a fundamental flaw with community policing is that at the end of the day, the police are still deciding who is and isn't a part of the community. And oftentimes you see that folks who are involved in community policing efforts or folks who engage with the police at their like community events are the ones that are already sympathetic to the police. And they're usually also folks who are homeowners who have some amount of clout and control in the community. You rarely sort of see unhoused or immigrant or Black and brown folks wanting to engage in community policing efforts. And it makes a lot of sense because you're not going to see someone who has past trauma with the police want to be involved in a community policing effort. And you can see this really, really strongly in places like the Bay Area where there's a huge disparity of income and gentrification. It's only going to sort of exacerbate the problems that the community already has, as opposed to sort of solving the root cause of harm and the root cause of why folks are harming other folks at its core. And so I think community policing in a nutshell just replaces the same problems that we already have, but just does so under the guise of engaging with the community. And so it doesn't really work as a sufficient reform. And we've already sort of talked about why in general reforms don't work. Yeah, I think that's all. I'll start there. I'll pass it to someone else.
Thanks so much. Kay, would you like to tackle this next?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, the issue with policing is not that like people in communities like need more friends, or like they need more like barbecues or like basketball games. And so when people, I would just say that like those types of events that you're just touching on are really condescending, and also just really confusing, because they don't get to the root of the issue. Another thing is that like the idea of community policing, like just the idea of community, like whose community and how would those parameters even be decided? Because community is not just about like physically like living or like physically inhabiting an area. There's so much more to it than that. And I think that that's something that ideas of community policing don't really ever address.
I would just add that the concept of community policing is really an outgrowth of colonial counterinsurgency strategy. and understanding the connection between that history and what's happening now with community policing is absolutely vital. So the concept of community policing was designed to be, it is modeled after French counterinsurgency tactics in Algeria, colonial Algeria and Vietnam. And those concepts were brought into the US through various military and intelligence bureaucracies as a way of thinking about how colonial occupiers were able to pacify a native population. And there's a lot of writing from the 50s, 60s, and 70s about how those tactics can be brought into mainstream American policing. It's absolutely vital to understand that community policing isn't some recent creation of well-meaning liberal reformers designed to like meaningfully address police violence after the killing of Michael Brown or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, anything like that. It has a long history, and that history is deeply tied to, as Kay mentioned, capitalism, to white supremacy, but also to like colonial conquest. And there's some really great reading I would recommend if folks are interested in learning more about this. Both the book Our Enemies in Blue by Christian Williams has a long history of this, and also all the scholarly work of Stuart Schrader, who writes, I think, really beautifully and eloquently about the history of this counterinsurgency and its connection to community policing.
Thank you, Alec. You and all of our panelists, you all have touched upon these ideas of harm and crime and the people in power, which kind of is a perfect segue into our next question, which is, what is the difference between crime and harm? How do legal and social definitions of crime influence policing, and more specifically, who is being policed? And how do these differing definitions relate to mass incarceration and calls for abolition? And we'll start with you, Alec.
Yeah, so much of my work in at least writing in recent years has been trying to understand this question of what is crime and how do we understand the concept of crime and how it differs from harm. So I really appreciate the question. I think at a really basic level, societies decide what to make legal and illegal based on who has power in that society. And so if there is a very unequal society with a ruling class that has certain interests, it's of course going to decide what is a crime and what is not a crime based on those interests. So that is why at different points in American history, and if you look at different societies around the world, wildly different definitions of crime prevail, right? At different times in this country's history, it's been completely illegal to possess the marijuana plant. It's also been completely illegal, right? It's been completely illegal to possess the cocaine plant. It's been completely legal to possess the cocaine plant. Both of those switches were made at very particular political moments in this country's history when the ruling class elite desired to give more control to police and state actors to criminalize and surveil and control the lives of, in the case of marijuana, of Mexican-American immigrants, and in the case of cocaine, of Black Americans, largely in the South. The same is true across the whole domain of criminal law. Elites make decisions like, is it a crime to join a union? Is it a crime not to join a union? Is it a crime to have an abortion? Is it a crime to refuse to perform an abortion? All of these things, and I could give many, many examples. Is wage theft a crime? Is employment discrimination a crime? Is sexual violence against one's spouse a crime, right? These are all questions that have been answered in different ways throughout American history, depending on who's in power. And some of the most prominent examples of these are in recent years, that actually reached mainstream news was, is environmental pollution a crime, right? There was a lot of publicity around how the Koch brothers were attempting to lobby Congress to remove many of the environmental crimes from the code book. The banking lobby was very successful in the 1990s in getting President Clinton and the Democratic Party to remove various forms of derivatives trading as crimes. So the same thing that used to be a crime in the 1990s later became not only legal, but so celebrated that it led to many billionaires being created. And in fact, instead of being in jail cells, actually, they probably wouldn't have been in jail cells, because one thing we'll get to later is that even if something's a crime, police only prosecute some crimes against some people in some places. But instead of committing crimes, these very wealthy people now have their names on university buildings and hospitals and portions of the UCSF campus, I'm sure. I think it's really important to understand that those same practices, those derivatives, later contributed in a huge way to the housing crisis in the early 2000s. And so what's connected with harm, like fraudulent mortgage foreclosures, is not seen as a violent crime, even though it made hundreds of thousands of people homeless. And we know from really great public health research, actually killed way more people than all official murders in those years combined. So I think it's very, very important to understand the mechanisms by which certain conduct, and typically in this country's recent history, it's been conduct associated with racial minorities, poor people, vulnerable people, particularly in recent years, certain types of just mere existence by the most vulnerable people in our society, for example, trans people, has been criminalized in new and creative ways. I think that's a vital thing to understand, that our society is not deciding what is a crime based on what causes harm or some really great objective empirical analysis of how bad something is versus something else. It's making those decisions based on political power and how it serves the interests of people with the most power.
Thank you for your insight. Aditi, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's that much I would add. I think Alec did a really great job, and obviously I think is an expert in this area. I think maybe the one little piece of context that I might add is around even after the lasting impacts of qualifying things as legally defined as crime versus not, and how we think of a shift of when something becomes legal or illegal as sort of the ultimate shift in that situation. And I think it's important for us to also recognize the lasting impacts of criminalization of certain things. So really tangibly, Alec talked about the legalization and decriminalization of marijuana in the country, and you still sort of see the lasting impacts of the criminalization of marijuana across the country. So that is really specifically in folks still having marijuana convictions on their records more often than not, and then also being shut out of the marijuana industry in different cities and states in which they're living. And so we're not only sort of legally defining certain crimes, but then also using that to shut folks out of benefit when things are legalized. And I think following that through and understanding that legalization or decriminalization is not sort of the last step in repairing the harms of criminalization, but instead sort of thinking about it in terms of how can we start to repair those harms when we do start to decriminalize things, I think is also really important. But I'll pass it to Kay to see if they have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, y'all both did a great job breaking it down. I would just say that, and I'll probably end up talking about this later, because of the way that we handle crime, that creates conditions to where people don't want to admit to causing harm, which is actually something that we all do all the time. But because of the fact that we live in a society that conflates harm with crime, and if you commit crimes, then therefore you're a bad person, no one actually wants to take accountability for small things because of the fear that's instilled in them. And then, yeah, I mean, like Alex said, crime isn't actually, or making something illegal isn't actually about preventing harm. It's often about revenue, what can generate the most revenue for the state, and also about keeping some groups of people away from other groups of people. And the key group that crime keeps people away from is Black people, and also Black and disabled people. And I mean, even just on a micro level, there are so many things that people do throughout their lifetime that are considered illegal, and no one actually suffers from those choices, but because of the crime framework that we have, again, people don't actually want to admit to that.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Those are really insightful answers. On sort of a related note, there's and Alec, we'll go to you because I think you've been pretty outspoken about this. There's been an uptick in the media in reports of crime, especially here in San Francisco, about retail theft. And some proponents of defunding argue this is a narrative shift to push back against defunding and not reflective of general crime data, in which, quote unquote, crime has been decreasing for several decades as well as in recent years. Could you share some insights on these media narratives and how they affect materially policy and funding decisions?
Yes. So I want to make 2 points. Not only has there been wildly misleading media coverage about, so-called crime data, but also, crime data as a concept is very poorly misunderstood. It's completely manipulable by police officers and tells us very, very little about society. It's sort of constantly being sort of used by police for any number of different agendas at different times. Sometimes they actually want to make crime look like it's going down, so they manipulate the numbers in that direction. Sometimes they want to make it look like crime is going up. And the whole time, there's really no analysis of like, what kind of human flourishing is happening in these communities? What is a more holistic understanding of well-being and safety? But the thing that I want to note, most prominently about the narrative in San Francisco's media and sort of across the country in recent months is that all of this discussion about a so-called surge or wave in crime, which is again contrary to all of the police data, which shows huge decreases in every single form of so-called nonviolent and violent crime except for homicide, is a connection, an unstated often assumption that the police are somehow related to those crime statistics. There's not a single shred of evidence that policing is correlated with these so-called crime. Nobody has any idea of what possible connection police might have to, for example, rising or lowering homicide rates. If the homicides in San Francisco go from 30 one year to 37 another year, there's not a single person on the planet, police chief or otherwise, who can identify some change in policing that led to that increase or decrease. And in fact, the research shows that other things are much more strongly correlated with whether a society is violent or not. So there is a lot of research around the world about how levels of inequality and poverty in a given society are actually much more significantly determinative of levels of violence. So I think one huge mistake that the media in particular in San Francisco, and in particular the local TV news stations and the San Francisco Chronicle are making, is that every time they make some assertion about crime, they link that to some policing activity or some arrest or some failure of the probation or the DA's office or the police to make an arrest or to sentence someone to long enough time or to put them in jail after probation violation. None of that stuff is correlated with increased crime. And in fact, all of the available evidence that we have from several decades suggests that putting people in jail, even for short periods of time, actually increases the likelihood of them committing crime in the future. And so it's almost, to me, like climate denial. The media's insistence on this sort of anti-scientific rhetoric that somehow various forms of policing or non-policing are connected to increasing rates of violent crime has no support in the scientific literature, and is instead linked to a really strong, heavily politicized right-wing agenda. You can see, for example, in the New York Times reporting last week that I've been highly critical of, they regurgitated through a series of so-called experts the so-called Ferguson effect, which was a police union right-wing talking point very prominently in force now in San Francisco that was popularized by James Comey. And the idea was that civil rights criticism of police in the wake of the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders led somehow to police pulling back, and that charging decisions by San Francisco's DA and police in San Francisco pulling back as a result of protests and the DA actually is what's leading to this so-called increase in crime. And that is wrong on every level. And it's so wrong that it strikes me as worth making some parallels to the sort of climate denial movement.
Thank you so much. I think after this, we'll go to Kay, but one thing I wanted to jump in here and moderate sort of for the scientists in the room, which is most of the people in the room, is I think what Alec said is kind of about reasoning from first principles, right? Which is that we have sort of assumed in this, I guess, quote unquote, yeah, so we've sort of assumed that there's a correlation between policing and safety, and we don't really interrogate that. And then when we're sort of are thinking about implementing evidence-based policy, there doesn't actually seem a lot of evidence for our current policies as they relate to policing. So that's for the scientists in the room. Okay, I'll go to you now.
Yeah, so I live in Atlanta, and the city just voted to, I want to say it's $90 million. Yeah, $90 million. They're going to invest $90 million into building a cop training center on one of like the last remaining undisturbed places of land in Atlanta. And this place is also a site of like an old prison farm. And one of the like justifications they have for doing that, despite taking public comment and 68% of public comment not approving of this plan, was just like crime statistics and this idea of like rising crime. And now we're also having like a mayoral election, and basically like all of the people who are running for office are like running under this banner of being like tough on crime. And no one is like stopping to consider the fact that the statistics are not actually true, or there's so much missing from them. But something else is that like even if crime were technically like rising, are people just forgetting the fact that we literally are in the middle of COVID, where the government gave some of us, not all of us, maybe like $2,000 for like a 2-year period to like deal with a really traumatic and completely destabilizing event. So even if crime were rising, like of course it were rising, we are going through such a huge time of like economic need, and also people are experiencing the effects of like prolonged isolation from each other. To expect everyone to come back and interact with each other in like a productive way when our government completely failed us again, I think is nonsensical. So even if crime statistics were true, I don't want to be like, so what, but like, duh, of course people are looking for like alternative methods to like meet their needs. Something else is just like the same thing like with crime statistics goes on with like true crime, which is like taking over, especially like if you're like into like podcasts or like TV shows. It's just the idea that like if you, and it's honestly what my mom does when it comes to COVID. Like just the idea, if you consume like 4,000 articles about this thing a day, you'll suddenly like be able to keep yourself safe and hyper vigilant without actually like understanding like why these things happen or how these things happen. And I feel like the same thing goes on with like crime statistics, where people, I mean, even my own family is just like, crime is rising, crime is rising, crime is rising. And I'm like, okay, so what exactly am I supposed to do with that information? Like, again, if it were true, like, what does that actually mean for me? Am I supposed to never leave my house? Like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, thank you so much. Aditi, I know you also wanted to add about San Francisco.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'll add is similar to what Kay was just saying in terms of how folks are using the so-called increasing crime statistics to then increase the scope of the prison industrial complex and the scope of policing. And that's happening in San Francisco as well. There's an increase in the sort of staffing of SFPD and new units to sort of quote unquote stop shoplifting and sort of provide individual corporations with security around quote unquote retail theft. And I think it's really important to sort of like investigate not only the articles and narrative around this sort of like fictionalized narrative of increasing crime, but then how that then is used by politicians and police chiefs to increase the scope and scale of policing in local areas as well.
Thank you, Aditi. Now that we've sort of defined crime and are looking more at the narratives of crime, we'd like to move more into like a safety aspect of this. So one of the primary arguments against police abolition is that it puts public safety at risk. What is the connection between policing and public safety, if any? And as an abolitionist, how do you respond to people's concerns about feeling safe in the absence of police? And Aditi, we can start with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think there's not really any connection between policing and public safety. Every single time police are entering into a situation after harm is caused, they're not stopping or preventing harm from being caused. And so it's like pretty clear that they're not actually providing us with public safety. And I think more than that, police, I think we've talked a little bit about this, but police don't actually solve the root causes of any harm. And they usually exacerbate those root causes instead. Usually we see, oftentimes folks having a lack of financial resources, mental health services, or housing, and policing and the prison industrial complex as a whole, doesn't actually fix any of those root causes. And those are the things that we should be focusing on instead of on policing. And I think it's also when we think about the militarization of the police, oftentimes it's the police that are bringing violence into the situation. They're the ones that come into interactions with guns and with tasers and with other sort of weapons. And so they are, in essence, actively escalating a situation to increase the violence in it. And I think that's pretty clear that that is not going to provide public safety if you're sort of entering into a situation without guns and adding guns into the mix. Like that's not going to keep anyone safe. That's just going to escalate and add more harm. And I think it's super important to think about the ways in which there are communities without police that already exist. So you can see this in white suburban communities where there are few, if any, police. And you see sort of like when there's harm caused in those communities, they have the resources to either stop the harm from being caused in the first place, or have the tools and resources in place to heal and protect from that harm after it's caused without the police. And I think those are essentially abolitionist communities, or communities where police have been abolished. And I think it's a quote that we were talking about a little bit earlier today, but those are the ones that are also the most well-resourced. And so it's pretty clear that it's resourcing and allowing for access to resources that is what provides public safety rather than policing in the prison industrial complex.
Thank you, Didi. Kay or Alec, would you like to also provide some insights to this question?
Yeah, briefly, I feel like safety is kind of like I was saying, it's one of those words that's similar to community in the sense that like, what does safety mean? Because for me, safety, like if I'm entering a place with police presence, I instantly feel unsafe. But for other people, that signifies safety. And for the majority of people, especially within the US, their ideas of safety are anti-Black, and they're classist, and basically rooted in wanting to, like, feeling safe for them is about being away from people who often don't look like them, or being kept away from people that they think are inherently deviant, which usually, in most cases, people assume are Black people. So just the idea of like safety in general, I don't think that that's something that can kind of be like accomplished. Like, I don't think that we can come to a consensus about like public safety without interrogating like the ways that safety and like, yeah, the idea of safety has been weaponized. And then, yeah, I mean, I would say that policing and public safety are tied together, just in the sense that I feel like policing is what makes the public unsafe. We have like, every time we leave our house, or even if we're in our house, like we're living under fear of surveillance, and we're living under like fear of police violence. Like that to me, I think is the public safety issue.
Thank you, Kate, for that insight. Alec, would you like to add some final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is potentially obvious, but if policing and prisons and prosecutors and judges, probation officers and handcuffs and cages made us safe, we would be the safest society in the history of the world. And so the very fact that all of these people think we're not safe and that crime is perpetually rising is strong evidence that their particular approach, which, we cage more human beings than any society in the recorded history of the world. We cage Black people at a rate 6 times that of South Africa at the height of apartheid. So if human caging and policing made us safe, you'd think that we'd be seeing really different results. I think this gets to Kay's really important point, which is what is safety? Whose safety? I mean, if we're talking about like safety for large aggregations of wealth and safety for privately enclosed property that a small number of people own, then we actually do live in a very safe society. And so like that's a really important, like for me, when I hear terms like violent crime, my mind starts to think about, well, what do they really mean by violence and safety, right? Because in my mind, I think that a child drinking water that's been poisoned with lead is not safe. Or someone who doesn't have a place to sleep on a cold night, not safe. Lack of access to basic healthcare and nutritious food. Those are things that I think make me and my community less safe, right? And when I think of violent crime, I think of things like a fraudulent foreclosure on a home that kicks a family out on the street. That to me is a violent crime. And so I think it's really important that we interrogate these notions, because if we have a more expansive and broad understanding of what violence is, to me, it's violent if someone can't afford a meal and they want to take food from a grocery store to put metal chains on their body and put them in a cage for that. That to me is violent, and that's a crime against humanity. And like, but you don't need to adopt views as radical as that to understand that the very basic things we're being told about even sort of police-defined crime and investments in carceral punishment are completely inconsistent with even the most basic articulation of the evidence. And I think it's very, very telling that police themselves for years, every major US jurisdiction, devoted way more resources to marijuana arrests, driving on suspended licenses for unpaid debt, disobeying police orders than they did to sexual assault. They have tens of thousands of untested rape kits in every jurisdiction. Only 4% of all police time across the country is spent on what they call violent crime. So we can tell from their own actions that even they don't think that the things that they spend their time on are things that they think are connected to safety. And so what are they making those decisions for? What is the reason for those decisions? And I think that is, when we understand that, it calls into question everything else that they tell.
Yeah, thank you so much, y'all. Those are all really thorough answers. Sort of on a related note, in regards to carceral feminism, how do you respond to people who ask survivors of sexual assault, or how survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence and even murder will get justice without police and prisons? Or kind of more broadly, how will we handle violent crime? And this is actually very similar to a question someone else already asked in the chat. So. Okay, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm like, I wish I could reread the question, but it's in the chat. So I'm gonna do that. It's difficult because, I mean, I am a survivor of sexual violence, or what people would call violent crime. And so I understand just like how awful it can be. But for me, the thing that the moment where I was like, oh, I don't believe in prisons anymore, was just learning how prevalent sexual violence is within prisons. Just because like the whole concept of a prison is gender-based violence. Like from the moment you come in, you are segregated based off of your perceived gender. And if you're in a women's prison, you don't have access to like the things that you need. Well, in any prison, you don't have access to the medical care you need, but certain like things are heavily criminalized within women's prisons, where a lot of the people who are incarcerated there are survivors of sexual violence. So for me, I know that there's no way that we're going to like end rape or sexual assault while still having and maintaining our current system, because this system pretty much frames sexual assault or sexual violence as like something that bad people deserve.
Arbitrarily.
If you like,
Is there other models that you're waiting on?
okay, I'm gonna keep going. But like, if you think about like famous people who are incarcerated, like R. Kelly or Bill Cosby, etc., like a common refrain is like, "Don't drop the soap." Like people, like we all know just like how much like sexual violence takes place. Okay, within prisons. Yeah, and so for me, another thing is just that like, again, like cops are responsible for sexual violence themselves. Like they coerce people into like giving them sexual favors in order to like promise that they're not going to incarcerate them. Or yeah, they assault people daily. So with that in mind, I don't understand how those people would also be the people who are invested in actually ending sexual violence, when that's something that they like log into work to do daily, or like log into work to ignore daily. So without police or prisons, how will we handle violent crime? I mean, this is something where it's like, I don't have like the answer, like first we'll do this and then we'll do that. But I do know that police and prisons get billions of dollars a year to try things that completely fail. And then they use it as justification to get even more money. And I feel like if survivor-led efforts, like the ones that I'm working on right now, if we had just like a 10th of the money that they had, maybe we could give a more concise or more imaginative answer. So I'm not entirely sure like how sexual violence would be handled without police and prisons, but I do know that it would be a lot better than the system that we have right now.
Thank you so much for that and for sharing your experience. Aditi, do you want to go next on this one? And then everyone should feel free to pass.
Yeah, I think that was a really thorough answer, and I don't really know if I have anything to add. I think the one like framing that I find really useful just in terms of thinking about this question is like asking whether we're quote unquote handling violent crime right now. And I think it's pretty clear that we're not able to handle it as a society. We're not actually stopping that harm from being caused in the first place. And I think the question really is like, how can we experiment? How can we ask communities what they need, as opposed to just providing more policing as the answer? And I think both Alec and Kay have already talked about how they've sort of shown that that really hasn't been effective. And so putting more money into an ineffective solution is not going to suddenly make it more effective. So that's maybe a little bit of addition to that.
Alec?
Just really quickly, I mean, everything that's been said was really beautifully said. I agree with it 100%. I would just add that one of the most damning indictments of our current system is that the vast majority of sexual assaults are never reported. People don't bring that harm to the criminal punishment bureaucracy because they don't believe it has anything to offer them. And what abolitionists are trying to do is not like create a world where more people report their sexual assaults and a higher percentage of those people are then punished in the institutions where they're going to be sexually assaulted themselves. But abolitionists are actually interested in creating a world without sexual assaults to report. And it's that focus on things like toxic masculinity and the reasons for gender-based violence and the inequality and alienation and lack of connection to other people and cycles of trauma that create gender-based violence that abolitionists are focused on eradicating. And that's just, to me, there's no more perfect indictment of the system than that.
Thank you so much for all of your responses. Now that we are moving into more of accountability versus punishment, what is the difference between punishment and accountability? How does the current system fail to hold perpetrators of harm accountable? And what could accountability look like? Kate, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so punishment for me is not a sustainable response to harm because it doesn't actually, like, I feel like we keep being like the root causes, but like literally like it doesn't actually like get to the root causes of like why someone engaged in a behavior. And it's not actually like invested in stopping that harm from happening long term. It's just a solution for stopping that harm like in the present versus accountability, which is often a longer process, but is actually in place to like make sure that that harm doesn't happen again. And also seeks to understand again, like why that harm took place. And then also like punishment is coercive. Like people, like no one is really like, yay, like I'm really excited to be like punished for like and disposed of for the things that I've done. And people might not feel that way about accountability, but at least with accountability, it still recognizes the fact that, like I was saying earlier, we all harm people. And it's more productive to try to understand where that comes from versus pretending that none of us do it. And if we just isolate a few people or a few bad apples, we can actually like keep people safe. And yeah, so like even the last question where it was like asking about like how survivors will get justice. For me, justice isn't more people being punished because that doesn't undo the violence that happened to me, and it also doesn't keep other people in the future. It doesn't prevent other people in the future from experiencing that violence. So for me, I'm more invested in finding ways that people who engage in certain behaviors can practice accountability with people in their community, so that other people don't have to experience what I and other survivors have gone through.
Thank you, Kay. Alec, would you like to provide some input to this question?
I don't have anything to add to that answer. Sorry, I couldn't get my unmute button up.
No worries. Okay, so with that, we can move on to our next question. Or
Okay.
Aditi, do you have anything to add to this question?
Perfect.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm going to take this one moment just for a technical thing. I'm going to mute everybody. I think that's only going to apply to participants, just so we don't have another overlap of sound like that. Sorry about that, Kay. And then with that, our next question is about the San Francisco policing budget. So the San Francisco policing budget is over $1 billion with a B. Actually, one of my panelists corrected me. It's actually $1.2 billion. Thank you, Aditi. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore described abolition as not absence, but presence. Where and how should cities like San Francisco invest funds from defunding the police? What kind of services could we fund to keep us safe that are not law enforcement or even the practice of policing each other? And Aditi, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so just to put the $1.2 billion in context as well, the full San Francisco budget is right around $13 billion. So we are spending almost 10% of our city budget on the prison industrial complex. So we're not spending 10% of our budget on literally anything else. And one of the things that is often said in the defunding movement and in budget work in general is that a budget is a reflection of our values. And so it's pretty clear here that city officials are choosing to put money into policing, and they're choosing to fund violence. And I think we could do so much with that 10%, with that $1.2 billion. It would be incredible to see what our city would look like if we put that money into housing or education and healthcare. To give a little bit more specifics in the city of San Francisco, so every year our city spends $23 million on special units in SFPD targeting unhoused people. We also put $9 million into, I don't know if folks have seen them if they're from San Francisco or the Bay Area, but there are mounted units. So it's basically cops that are on horseback, and we spend $9 million for the horses and for their feed and for the cops that patrol the city on those horses. And with just like 20% of the city budget, with 20% of the SFPD budget, we could end homelessness through permanent supportive housing and services, which is wild when you think about the fact that part of the policing budget in San Francisco goes to the sheriff, and they are the ones that are actually enforcing evictions. So we could be stopping those evictions by actually housing people, and instead we're funding the people that are used to enforce evictions. And that's like a really clear way that you can see what we're choosing to fund and how we're choosing to not support people. To put it in the context of education also, so CCSF this year had a $36 million budget deficit, and we pay SFPD officers $31 million just in overtime. So if we were to cut the overtime budget of SFPD, we could basically be able to fund CCSF to its full budget that it needs. And I think the question really here is, how can we divest from policing and refund life-affirming care? And I think that people know what they need. We just need to ask them what they need and use funding from policing as a really clear way to provide life-affirming care to folks, as opposed to choosing, as I said, choosing to fund violence in the prison industrial complex in San Francisco.
Thank you, Aditi. Would Alec or Kay like to provide input onto this question? Maybe not necessarily for San Francisco, but your respective origin.
Yeah, I've never even been to San Francisco, so someone should fix that because my best friend lives there. But while you were talking, something that came to mind was just, if you're saying that only 20% of the budget could be used to like solve homelessness, then it makes it really apparent that like the city is not invested in actually solving homelessness. It's more so about punishing people for being poor, and making sure that other people are witnessing that punishment, so that they don't end up like them. So that's the only thing that I would add, but I learned a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really great, Aditi. I also think that it's important for us to think about all of the interests that benefit. So when you say something like, we could spend only 20% of the police budget to, eradicate homelessness in San Francisco, you can think about like, well, something that obvious, why isn't that happening? And who is benefiting from that? And what interests are standing in the way? And really thinking about, for the city that you live in, whether it's San Francisco or Atlanta or Washington, D.C., where I live, like really understanding like, and naming like, these are the groups, the small, and I guarantee you, they represent a pretty small percentage of the city's population. These are the groups who benefit from a situation in which we are spending, if we spent even 20% less on guns and tasers and surveillance equipment and tanks and armed officers who have huge rates of physical and sexual violence, right? Keep in mind, San Francisco police, like every other police department, do not count their own crimes in the crime data they report to you, right? So we have no sense of, and by just even casual very conservative estimates, if police included their own crimes in crime data, it would completely reverse crime trends in every major US city. So knowing all of that, there's a small group of people in San Francisco that includes most of the reporters for the San Francisco Chronicle and most of the TV news people, who understand that it's better for them to concoct a narrative that drives resources to police instead of to giving humans the basic needs to survive. And that's astonishing. And I think it's a moral responsibility for all of us, even those of us who aren't organizing with defund SFPD now, which maybe all of you should start getting involved with. But like, what do we do about it? And what do we do in our own lives, our own social circles, and our own professional circles to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore? And that I just encourage you all to think about that tonight.
Thank you so much for those responses. We have time for one bonus question. In the lines of, so let's say that we are abolitionists, and one critique from other abolitionists is jail killer cops is a pro-police policy, or one critique from other abolitionists is the term jail killer cops is a pro-police policy. Could you talk a bit about why jail killer cops is considered to be a pro-police policy, and how do we respond to feelings of an eye for an eye or wanting to cage cops who murder Black and brown people? There's some tweets for our audience. We can start. Kay, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even talk about this that much more, this much, because every time I do, people bite my head off for it. But yeah, I mean, basically, like, if we're rooting for cops to go to prison, or if we're letting that be our like sole or main organizing demand, and we're rooting for them to go to prison because they're bad, what message does that send to all of our comrades that are currently incarcerated? And how does that reflect the ways that we think about them? Because we can't have it both ways. Like, either prisons are awful and they're not actually reflective of like who's like a good or bad person, and instead they're like anti-Black and like classist, like and ableist institutions, or prisons are actually like really good and they're doing their job, and because of that, that's why these cops need to go in there. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And then also an issue with like the like jailing killer cops like demand is that, similar to like other reforms, it's just, I think, a distraction. It's very, very unlikely that like cops will go to jail, and if they do, it's like an isolated incident, and it doesn't actually like do anything to prevent the violence that they cause. It doesn't keep people actually safe. It doesn't bring back the people that they killed. Instead, it really is just a tactic to kind of like get everyone to calm down, and not ask for a more radical, or what I think is a more productive vision. And so I think it's normal to want like revenge, but when that becomes like our sole organizing force, or like our sole like motivation, we're not actually furthering abolition, and instead we're giving more money and more time, and more like investment and resources into the prison industrial complex.
Thank you, Kay. I feel like you really touched on a lot of concepts that we talked about in this panel. Alec, would you like to add some insight to this?
Sure. One additional thing I would add is that the jailing of police officers feeds into one of the most fundamental misconceptions and flaws and problematic assumptions about the way our society works generally, which is that when bad things happen, they are the fault of a bad person. And this is one of the same flaws that happens throughout the criminal system generally. We have a tendency in our society to blame individuals, and particularly bad individuals, for bad outcomes. And the reality is that an incident of police violence is the result of the sort of local political machine that put that cop on that street at that moment, that gave the cop that gun at that moment, at that location, right? That criminalized whatever it was that cop was enforcing at that moment in that place, right? And so on and so forth. There's a whole set of institutions. And so a much more rational response, if one is interested in actual accountability, is to, when an act of police violence comes, what the system wants you to do is punish that individual cop because it wants to blame its own systemic failures on one bad actor. That's why you see police unions and police, when someone is caught on video like Derek Chauvin, everyone from the police unions to the prosecutors to the judges condemns him. He's sentenced for murder and he goes off to state prison, right? That's important to the system because it's deflecting. Whereas you start talking about reducing the budget of the Minneapolis Police Department so that a cop is not going to be in that position to do what they did to George Floyd, but instead to spend the money on supportive housing or on visioning out what worker-owned co-ops throughout Minneapolis might look like, or whatever it is, right? Mental health care, universal health care in the city. Then people freak out, the real estate developers, the business leaders, the police unions, right? Because that would be real accountability, taking away their resources. And that fundamentally is why you see so many prominent liberals saying that defund the police is a bad slogan, right? They want to denigrate that term as a slogan when in fact, it's actually an accountability demand. It is saying the response to this incident of police violence is to remove the resources that are systemically enabling this violence. That is the only thing that will actually reduce instances of police murdering Black people. And so I think it's a really fundamental and very profitable feature of contemporary capitalism that sort of good and bad are seen as like the result of individual choices and not sort of systemic forces. And that's something that comes to mind with the question that you asked.
Aditi, did you want to do this question or did you want to pass?
I think the one thing that I might add is actually from the video we watched at the beginning, which is sort of where Mr. Capehart talked about like reframing what we mean when we say justice and accountability. And I think one of the tweets that, or the images that y'all showed in the slide was sort of like realizing that the system that harms Black and Brown and Indigenous and unhoused folks is never going to be the system that provides accountability and healing. And I think the idea of supporting demands that jail killer cops, what it does is it legitimizes the system as one that will give us some amount of justice and accountability. And by sort of reframing that, we can also like sort of work towards the path of abolition much more actively instead of supporting it through that slogan.
Thank you all so much. We have time for questions from the audience, which is very exciting. We've gotten a few that were DM'd to us. Since UCSF is a public health institution, we're going to start with this one. Can public health be a tool for abolition in policing and prisons? If so, or if not, do healthcare workers play a role in abolition? Does anyone want to start? I know this one is sort of off the cuff, but.
One thing that I'm thinking about is just, so yes, and it feels like a lot of reformers tackle like reform and then they say they're using like a public health lens. And so they're like using the field of public health to like help them build legitimacy instead of like actually, well, what I think, actually actually understanding what drives violence. But do healthcare workers play a role in abolition? Yeah, because we all do. Like we're all touched by the prison industrial complex, and we all have a role to play, and we all have things that we can learn and we can do to like undo what is happening. And yeah, I think this idea that like only some careers or like some professions have to do with it, I think is not really productive when it comes to organizing. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Aditi or Alec, did you want to try tackling this question, or you just shake your head no if you don't?
Go for it, Alec. I was gonna say the only thing that I might I want to actually uplift the Do No Harm Coalition in San Francisco. I'm sure a lot of folks on the call know about it, but they're a group of folks in the public health field that are sort of thinking about this very question, and I think thinking about the ways in which public healthcare workers or healthcare workers in general can support not only in sort of the very active of revolution in terms of street medics and medic training and supporting folks on the ground, but also sort of long term, what does it look like to provide real tangible healthcare to folks? Because we've sort of talked about the ways in which healthcare is the thing that provides public safety. And I think healthcare workers banding on that and sort of showing that to folks can really also validate that as a way to spend our money and a place to reinvest when we are divesting from policing. So sort of like making that explicit and showing that connection, I think could be a really powerful tool that healthcare workers can help support the movement in specifically around defunding, but around abolition as a whole, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like Kay, I'm a little bit perplexed by the way in which reformers kind of like resort to public health discourse. And I think it's dangerous for public health workers to, get involved in some of the typical ways in which they're, I've seen, at least over the last few years. I think I would be more interested in, like, these are not, put it this way, the problem with the system is not that like the people running it are ignorant and they just need to be made more aware of the public health research and public health like perspective. And like once they learn about public health, they're going to automatically stop doing everything they're doing. They know that like it doesn't reduce drug use to embark on a 40-year multi-trillion-dollar war on drugs. It's not that they need to understand, the addiction researchers' perspective better. I think it's a question of power. It's a question of power and profit. And so if public health workers want to get involved in this fight, they have to do what everybody else has to do and have an actual theory of power and how they're going to build power. So I think it would be a meaningful difference, for example, if home health workers, graduate students, doctors, nurse unions, and others in San Francisco came together and said, you know what? 20% of that police budget should come to us. It should be for community clinics and care and supportive housing and home health workers for people who have certain disabilities or whatever it is, right? And like they should say, as a matter of political power politics in San Francisco, we are going to build a multiracial working class labor coalition centered around health and health services, and we're going to take down the police union. And we're a more powerful force if we combine with the teachers and others. And like that would be a way of getting involved, not the only way, but like a way that actually understands the power dynamics at play and might be able to use a public health organizing strategy to change the narrative in San Francisco with the credibility that public health workers and experts might be able to bring to this discussion of defunding and reinvesting the San Francisco police budget.
Thank you all so much for those answers. I want to also give a shout out of a related group, DPH Must Divest, which is dphmustdivest.com. And they began actually when a Black midwife here at UCSF went on strike because UCSF General Hospital is one of the only hospitals in the country to use sheriffs as its security force. And she's a Black woman, and they were harassing a patient outside. They violated HIPAA by disclosing that he was COVID positive, and then left her alone with them after she said this is like an inappropriate level of violence with a patient outside of SF General. So from that grew DPH Must Divest. So that's dphmustdivest.com. And then I think one thing I wanted to add is that there are many wonderful clinicians, doctors, researchers here at UCSF, but I was at SF General Hospital as a patient or as the friend of a patient a few months ago. and there was a Black man who was in distress. And I just want to say that we can all participate in the systems of policing. And so that Black man was, I would say, with the level of anger that a white woman has of being mistreated and wants to speak to the manager. And they called the sheriffs to come into the room to restrain him, who then called SFPD to restrain them. And when I came out to say like, hey, this seems inappropriate, they told me to go back to the room where they would arrest me. So I just want to say that there were many nurses and doctors in that room. And there are also who kind of participated in the system of policing and policing each other. So I just want folks to be conscientious of that in your clinical and care settings. And then with that, I do want to move to closing statements, which is sort of some of the actionable things that we have. Actually, Alec, will start with you, since I know you have a hard stop coming up.
I thought this was just a really wonderful discussion, and like I don't have anything substantive to add other than being grateful for including me with Kay and Aditi, and thank you Alina and Leandro for moderating and hosting and really amazing questions. And I hope it's been somewhat informative, and I hope folks will think about how they can get involved in the local fight, because it's the brutality and pain and trauma that this system is causing right now are just overwhelming, and it's easily preventable if we come together and organize around it. Thank you for including me.
Thank you so much. Aditi, we'll pass to you because we know you shared some slides with us in advance.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about this, so I'll just say this really quickly, but I just wanted to, since a lot of y'all, I'm sure, are from the Bay Area or San Francisco specifically, just wanted to give a little bit of context on the San Francisco police budget. So you can see here in this slide that the SFPD budget has increased. It's increased $300 million over the past decade. And so its scope has increased a lot over that time period. And I think we've talked already about sort of the things that we could do with that amount of money. And I wanted to also call into attention in the next slide, the ways in which a lot of what we were talking about in terms of media narratives around quote unquote like increased crime have been used by the right to then increase the scope of policing in San Francisco this year. And some really specific policies that are coming up are sort of an increase in potential sheriffs that are going to be on the streets of San Francisco to sort of like work for private corporations and be rented out by private corporations and be paid actually 1.5 times their salary to quote unquote reduce retail theft in the city. SFPD is also potentially going to be increasing their scope by creating a new unit to focus specifically on quote unquote retail theft. And I'm not sure if folks know about SFPD's 10B unit, but what it is it's basically like a rent-a-cop for local businesses and corporations in San Francisco. Folks can sort of rent police officers to serve as security for their stores or their businesses. And it accounts actually for 200,000 hours of policing every year. And that is potentially going to be expanded this year as well. And so you can see sort of like how the scope of policing is increasing, potentially going to increase this year, really specifically around having the private sector subsidize that increase. And so if folks are interested in getting involved in moving against these efforts and advocating against them, and opposing all of these policies, or get involved in any other way, there's a bit.ly link that I saw Alina just put in the chat. So feel free to fill out that form and get involved with defunding SFPD now if you're interested.
Thank you so much. And Kay, and then Jack, would you mind? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'll put the link in the chat, but right now I'm working on a campaign to free my friend Ashley Diamond, who is a Black trans woman who's incarcerated in Georgia. And right now, Ashley is in need of just like letters of support. So if you go to our website, you can quickly just fill out a form and give her a quick letter of support, and then we'll write them down and mail them to her. And also, if you visit the website, you can find out more. It's freeashleynow.com, and you can also find us on social media.
Okay, thank you so much. Can one of the SPG people please get the link from the slide and post it in the chat? The Defund SFPD Now link. Okay, so with that, we'll be wrapping up. So if you liked what you heard today and think that we are doing a great job and want to participate in more events like this, please join us by going spg@ucsf.org or DMing Jack or Alex or us. So that's spg@ucsf.org, or you can email us at spg@ucsf@gmail.com. If you also hate what we're doing, please join one of our meetings and tell us what we can do better. That's the best way to change what we're doing. And if you have any questions about what it's like to be a part of SPG, please feel free to stick around, and Jack, Alex, Chad, Kie, and I will all be around to answer any questions about what it's like to be a part of SPG. So thank you all so much for coming today, and we'll see you all at the next panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.